Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. I'm very happy to be with you today. I am Lemir Teron. I am an associate professor at Howard University, where my work deals a lot with what I'll be talking about today: urban forestry, urbanization, environmental justice generally, but I also do a lot of things in relation to energy policy, life cycle assessment. And increasingly, I'm trying to merge those worlds. What's the nexus between forestry and energy? As we think about the advances of climate change, if we're not serious about critically making that nexus, I think we might be in a world of trouble. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we've been working on over the last several years. This work was sponsored by the 2021 Challenge Grants from the Forest Service. And we have a slew of partners that went in on this project. At the time, I was at SUNY ESF, which you can see at the lower right-hand corner. And my co-PI, my PI on the project is Ted Indrini at SUNY ESF. We worked regularly and still do with the city of Syracuse, Davy Trees, which you all are familiar with, I'm for sure, and also the local conservation corps, Onondaga Earth Corps, which is a youth, young adult centered job training and readiness organization built around Save the Rain urban forestry. This project had three main goals. I'm going to talk to you about one of those, which is the playbook, which was mentioned earlier. But we had a couple of other goals that we wanted to develop with this project. Number one, we did a lot of urban heat island mapping, just thinking about how extreme temperatures can be regulated through advances in forestry. And then number two, we have a model that you all are probably familiar with: train the trainer. So how can we take lay populations, give them the tools of environmental science so that they can make informed forestry decisions in their neighborhood? So we'll talk a little bit more about that perhaps in the Q&A, but I want to focus the next several minutes on this playbook that we've developed. And as I said, me and Ted, we've developed a model that's pretty comprehensive. A core part of this is this urban reimagining. So this is a time for restorative justice. We've heard about several different iterations of environmental justice, and let me just speak very briefly about restorative justice. When we think about the assaults that have taken place in inner cities and other communities, specifically in Black neighborhoods in the early mid 20th century, we're talking about disinvestment, we're talking about deforestation, we're talking about redlining, locally unwanted land use siting. When we think about the special assaults that have inundated these communities, restorative justice mandates that we say, you know what, because of the acute and chronic harms, we got to do some things to right those past wrongs. Now, forestry alone, nobody's naive. Planting trees, vegetation strategies, those things alone aren't going to right any of those ills, but forestry, as part of an ensemble, a broader ensemble of other things, food policy, climate policy, can act in concert together to bring dignity, to help restore dignity in a lot of places that have been environmentally degraded. So let's take a look at some of the consequences of those assaults. If you look at the map that we created in the upper left-hand corner, that was the real-time temperature of the hottest day of the year in Syracuse, New York, 2022. And what we've done there is said, if we just change land cover, if we just change tree coverage by about 20%, you can see the cataclysmic drop in temperatures. Now, that's not a fanciful number. You may say 20%, that's a little bit aggressive. Well, we're in a special time. Not only is this a time for environmental justice consciousness, not only should we be thinking about restorative justice in this moment, we're also seeing a lot of things in the policy landscape that are online, interstates being decommissioned, that are going to literally give us room and space to engage in aggressive planting strategies. Not to mention the financial infrastructure associated with things such as the Inflation Reduction Act, which is sending billions of funds, over $1 billion of funds, into many so-called environmental justice communities. So let's talk about the playbook. So we took our expertise, we took the experience that we gathered in Central New York, and we said we really want to export this, not just in the Rust Belt, but we want to export this in many different locales across the country. And we built this, we created this nexus or this convergence of urban forestry and environmental justice. We centered it on six foundational questions. And because I only have about 6 more minutes left, of course, I'm not going to run you through the entire playbook, but I'd really love to focus on just a couple of these things right now. So number one, let's talk about number three. How do we grow urban and community forestry movements? We're offering as an anchoring question, how can UCF efforts catalyze public interest in supporting communities historically excluded from environmental planning and design? And in short, we do that by very conscientious partnerships. And we got to be serious about partnering, intentionally partnering with communities and organizations that haven't always been a part of the conversation. So when I think about some of my go-to partnerships, these are, yes, environmental organizations, but sometimes I'm partnering with a first aid organization like Force in Syracuse, focusing our resources on community enlightenment. So they do first aid training, CPR trainings. On paper, their mission statement probably has nothing to do with forestry, but when you think about providing those services, emergency services, disaster management services, in communities that often have high asthma rates, high particulate matter concentrations, I'd argue they're very much an environmental justice organization, certainly a public health organization. I spend a lot of time in public libraries speaking to the virtues of trees. To me, libraries may be the last trusted institution in our society. So it only makes sense because pretty much every population, although there are some sects of society that are trying to devalue libraries, ban books, etc., because every sect of society says, you know what, we find value in these institutions, I make sure that I do a healthy amount of programming. And libraries are always good in drumming up numbers. So getting people who are not historically a part of these forestry and vegetation conversations, they're good at getting them literally at the table. And in part two, technical support. So when you take lay populations, how are we arming folks through train the trainer and giving them technical skills, ultimately, not just so they can use the same iTree tools that I use to teach my class, or maybe that you use as a professional forester or arborist. We're teaching folks how to use these skill sets or to build these skill sets, because it's one thing for somebody to say, I want more trees in my neighborhood. It's a whole different level of engagement when folks have the scientific understanding, they know how to use these tools, and then they go to City Hall, then they go to the urban forester. I want these trees, and here's why. It's scientifically backed, maybe it's socioeconomically backed. That informs prioritization strategies beyond, I want more trees. Of course we do. We can now say we have the climate data, we have the particulate data, we have the flood data, we have the energy savings data that undergird our claims and wants. Now, I told you that the playbook is built on 6 pillars or 6 questions. Let's not be naive. There are innumerable questions when we're trying to link these worlds between community forestry and environmental inequality and making restorative justice reality. You know, we could have made an encyclopedia length playbook. Our goal wasn't to do that. So in addition to those 6 questions, we have a slew of case studies, on the ground knowledge, and just other undergirding questions that should allow you and your compatriots to get in the game if you historically haven't been thinking about your work within the context of environmental racism, environmental inequality, and movement towards environmental justice. So the elephant in the room, as we're prepping for this, hey, there are some real on the ground level things like, this all sounds good. How do you pay for it? And I think that's a valuable question. And I always like to throw, whenever I get asked that question, we're in a moment of crisis. So when we talk about climate vulnerability, in the same way we say, well, how do we pay for more equitable forestry? Or how do you pay for more hospitalizations related to extreme heat? How do you pay for vulnerable energy systems if we're not making transitions fast enough and competently enough? How do we pay for lost work days in association with extreme heat? How do we pay for flooded basements? So I really look at trees as not a total panacea, but an insurance policy, a mitigation practice, and just part of a deeper narrative of, hey, if you're not asking serious questions about how are you going to pay for those things on the back end, let's use that same energy to interrogate and send more money into forestry beyond the next 5 years related to the IRA. And then let me just make a final call for action. Where do we go from here? As I said, this is a unique moment in cities all across the country. As a matter of fact, across the planet. This is a moment of consciousness and restorative justice. So it's not just restorative in theory. We see interstates being decommissioned. We see highways that were targeted in Black communities due to environmental racism. These things are being decommissioned. It's time for us to kind of marry the end of the life cycle for these structures to potential opportunities related to vegetation and forestry strategies. And then number two, let's go beyond metrics. So we can talk about tools and particulate matters all day and energy savings, shade, etc. But we got to get our folks outdoors. This is part of a broader movement that we have to undergird related to ecological sensitivity and consciousness, i.e., we got to get people outdoors and planting. And then finally, just ask yourself this question: how is my daily work technically supporting those folks who are new to the game? So whether you're a person that went through my train the trainer program, whether you're a person just thinking about these forestry issues for the first time, let's think about how our expertise is cultivating knowledge in communities of folks that have historically been locked out of these conversations and opening up and broadening the dialogue around these issues. So I thank you very much for your time today. And we are going to pass the baton to our final colleague. The floor is yours.